It snarled like thunder and lunged like fire. The dog's teeth bared, its fur bristled as though the war still roared inside it. American soldiers backed away, their boots grinding dust as the German shepherd snapped at its chain, eyes wild with fury. No one could touch it. No one even tried anymore. "Devil on 4 legs," one Texan muttered. "Ain't nobody gonna tame that hound." Then a woman stepped forward. She was thin, silent, dressed in a plain POW uniform. Japanese. A nurse, they said, from somewhere near Nagasaki. The men scoffed. She didn't flinch. She knelt, spoke softly. Not in English, not in German, but in a voice that flowed like water over stone. And the beast sat down. The men stared in stunned silence. The war had taught them to expect cruelty. Not this. Not gentleness that disarmed monsters. In that dusty Texas yard, surrounded by barbed wire and ghosts of 2 empires, the enemy had done the impossible. She had tamed the untamable. Uemori never raised her voice. Not when the guards barked roll call through the sun-bleached yard, not when her bunkmate coughed blood in the middle of the night, and not even when the barbed wire gates clanged shut behind her for the first time. The Americans couldn't decide if she was terrifying or invisible. Some called her the quiet one, others just nodded stiffly when she passed. She rarely made eye contact. She moved like smoke, like someone trained to be small in the world. But the silence wasn't surrender. It was something else entirely. The guards joked she might have been some kind of spy. But she barely spoke English, and what little she did say came in halting fragments. "No pain," she once told the medic who checked her bandages. "It is past." Nobody asked what she meant. They didn't want to know. She had arrived in the camp 3 months earlier, brought in on the same dusty cattle truck as a handful of other Japanese prisoners, mostly auxiliaries, all women. Her papers said she'd been a nurse stationed on Mindoro, captured after the garrison collapsed. The men had expected emaciated wrecks, but Yui walked off the truck with shoulders straight and hands folded. One of the Texans spat in the dirt and muttered, "That one's got steel in her." The dog came weeks later. They called him Buck, short for some long code name scribbled on his transport tag, but nobody used it anymore. He was a German shepherd, massive, muscled, with a coat like singed smoke and a jaw that could shatter bone. They said he'd served in Europe, trained for recon, maybe even for kills. Something had gone wrong during his transport back. The MPs unloading him were left bloodied, one nearly losing a finger. Buck was thrown into an old storage cage behind the mess hall, chained twice over, and forgotten, except for the noise. His howls started at dusk and sometimes didn't stop until dawn. A sound that wasn't quite a bark, wasn't quite a cry, just raw, ragged fury. At first the men thought they could retrain him. They sent in a corporal who claimed he'd grown up with shepherds. The man came out with a torn sleeve and a trembling hand. They tried keeping him muzzled. He broke it. They tried keeping him sedated. He refused to eat. Eventually, Buck became more myth than dog. "That mutt's got the devil in him," one guard said after hearing him snarl through the fence. "Only thing keeping him from tearing through the camp is rusted steel." And then Yui appeared at his cage. Nobody noticed at first. She wasn't supposed to be there. Her work assignment was kitchen prep. But one morning, a guard on smoke break spotted her kneeling outside the enclosure. She wasn't touching the bars, just sitting, hands folded, knees on the dry earth. The dog was pacing inside, hackles raised, teeth bared. The guard shouted, started toward her, then stopped. Because Buck had stopped. The next day she returned. Same place, same posture. The dog didn't growl this time, just watched her. By the third day, the rumors had spread. Half the kitchen crew found excuses to slip outside, trailing scraps of bread or cigarette ash just to glimpse it. And there she was, a ghost in uniform, kneeling before the beast. Someone snapped a photo. The guards laughed nervously, told each other it was a fluke, that the dog was probably worn out. But then came the fourth day, and the fifth, until finally one guard, a grizzled Arkansas sergeant with scars down his arm, said what none of them wanted to admit. "That dog's not broken," he whispered. "She's speaking some language we don't know, and whatever it is, he understands it." Long before she spoke to beasts, Yui Mori had been trained to silence her own voice. In the narrow alleys of Nagasaki, beneath tiled roofs and paper lanterns, obedience was stitched into the very air she breathed. Her mother called it shikataganai, a phrase with no perfect English equivalent, but one that meant it cannot be helped. It was not a surrender, not quite. It was a discipline of acceptance. Speak little, step lightly, hide everything but duty. From the age of 7, Yui folded her futon with corners sharp enough to draw blood. She bowed until her knees ached. She spoke only when spoken to. When her father returned from the factory each night, weary and smelling of coal, she would kneel and serve his tea without looking him in the eye. Her older brother, Haruki, was different, rebellious, spirited. He once painted cherry blossoms on the inside of the schoolhouse walls and was beaten for it. Yui never forgot that sound, the cane, the stillness afterward, the silence in their home for weeks. Haruki would later march off in uniform, eyes full of pride, chanting slogans she would soon whisper in nursing drills. She never saw him again. When the war came, it swallowed everything, even language. She was selected for auxiliary service at 19, her hands steady, her voice soft. Nurses, they said, were weapons too. She was deployed to a field hospital outside Mindoro, where the jungle steamed and the wounded screamed through the leaves. Her days blurred into an endless rotation of morphine, blood, and whispered prayers over boys whose names she never learned. Her own officers barked orders louder than the bombs outside. She watched men slap crying comrades, watched surgeons perform amputations without anesthetic, watched a wounded private get kicked for not dying fast enough. No one apologized. No one cried. Weakness was the enemy. Mercy was treason. And yet, sometimes, she lingered too long at a bedside. Sometimes she slipped an extra spoonful of rice into a fevered man's tin. Once she hummed an old lullaby over a soldier's chest as he bled out. She never told anyone. These things could not be helped. The surrender came like a wave in reverse, not with a crash, but with a sucking silence. One day there were orders, the next only the sky. The officers disappeared first, then the rations, then the certainty. She and a small unit of nurses were captured days later, barefoot and empty-eyed, walking along a coastal trail with their hands already raised. The American soldiers who found them didn't shout. They offered canteens. One tried to smile. Yui looked at the water and thought, "This is the moment I will die." But the bullets never came. They were processed like shipments, stamped, tagged, moved, traded one jungle for another, this one of cement and steel. At night, she lay awake in holding tents where men muttered in languages she couldn't understand, and women stared at the floor like it might open. Food came on trays. Guards looked away when they changed. No one hit her. No one demanded an oath. And that terrified her more than any cruelty. Then came the ship, a long voyage across an ocean she once read about in textbooks. When it docked, Yui stepped off into a heat that felt like fire but smelled like sugar. Cattle trucks waited, and beyond them the red soil and endless sky of Texas. A camp, they said, but the beds had sheets, the showers ran hot, the guards did not leer. That first night someone gave her a cup of coffee. She took one sip and nearly cried, but instead she sat on her bunk, hands folded, and said nothing. Even then, she didn't know the dog was waiting. She only knew that this new silence, thick with kindness, was far more dangerous than any war she had known. The train had slowed through the dusty plains, the wheels groaning like an animal dying in its sleep. Huey sat rigid in her seat, her fingers clenched in her lap as the horizon unfolded. All red soil and sun-bleached fences, the land too wide, the sky too quiet. When the doors finally opened, she stepped down with the others, a ghost among shadows, expecting to be struck, spat on, humiliated. In the Empire, surrender was worse than death. It erased your name. It unstitched your ancestors from your blood. She had whispered the Bushido oath into the dirt when she enlisted, better to die with honor than live in shame. Yet here she was, alive, breathing, waiting for punishment. But it never came. Instead, she was led through gates lined with barbed wire into a camp that buzzed with something altogether foreign. Order. There were wooden barracks, neatly painted, paths swept clean, buckets at every corner, windows that actually opened. It was too clean, too calm, like a dream posing as a prison. Guards didn't bark commands, they spoke them. Clipped English, yes, but not cruel. One of them, a boy, barely old enough to shave, nodded at her when she passed. Nodded, as if she were a person. It made her skin crawl. Her first meal was the true betrayal. They called it mess hall, but it looked more like a church to her. Long rows of wooden tables, trays stacked like communion plates, and at the center of it all, the smell. It hit her like a memory. Thick, salty, primal. Bacon, sizzling on a griddle, crackling in grease. She froze in line. Her mind couldn't grasp it. Bacon was a word from before ration books, before jungle rot, before the dead stacked like kindling. She remembered her brother burning the last strip on a stove in Nagasaki just before deployment. He had laughed, said it tasted like victory, and now, here, the enemy cooked it for her. She took the tray with trembling hands. Eggs, bread, bacon, a steaming mug of something bitter and dark. She sat at the edge of the table, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. The bacon sat there, mocking her. A smell too soft for war, a texture too rich for shame. She ate it anyway, slowly. The fat melted on her tongue, and with it, something inside her cracked. Guilt rose sharp in her throat. I am eating like an American, while my mother, if she is alive, gnaws on bark. No one shouted. No one beat her for crying. The guard pacing the hall simply passed by, offered her a half-smile, and moved on. Later that night, she watched him again. The same boy guard, maybe 20, maybe younger. He sat near the fence with a cigarette and a harmonica, playing a tune she didn't recognize. The sound drifted soft into the barracks like smoke, lilting, sad, careless. She stared from behind the window slats, not understanding why the melody made her chest tighten. Music had always meant command back home, marches, anthems, drills. This was not that. In the mornings, she studied them, the guards. Not just their uniforms, but their faces. Some laughed with each other. One drew cartoons on napkins. Another handed out candy to a group of Italian POWs with the casual ease of a brother. These were not the monsters she'd been warned about, but that only made them more dangerous, because if they were not beasts, what did that make her? She still folded her blanket into perfect corners each dawn, still knelt to clean her shoes with a damp cloth, still recited the old phrases in her head like prayers, just to keep from forgetting who she was supposed to be. But the smell of bacon clung to her hands longer than memory, and every night she found herself watching the boy with the harmonica, listening for a mistake, a slip, anything to prove he wasn't human after all. It never came. The proof she was searching for, the sneer, the slap, the cruelty, never arrived. But something else did. He arrived on a truck that kicked up red dust and scattered birds from the wires. Buck. They said his name like a curse and a warning. He was taller than any dog WWII had seen, with a chest like a barrel and legs like coiled rope. His coat was streaked with black and sable, but his eyes were pale, sharp, feral. When he stepped down from the crate, the entire mess yard paused. The two handlers, both American MPs, gripped the leash with white knuckles. Someone muttered, "That's not a dog. That's war on four legs." Buck had been trained in Europe, Belgium or the Black Forest. No one could agree. What was certain was that he had served with infantry units on reconnaissance, maybe even patrol raids. One man claimed Buck had been used to sniff out partisans in the Ardennes. Another said he was a sentry dog turned attack hound. Whatever he had done, it left marks, not just the scars across his flank, but the way he moved, not with curiosity, but calculation. He didn't wag, he didn't whine. He paced, and his nails clicked like clock hands counting down. They put him in a cage at the far end of the compound, behind the kitchens, near the rusted fence that nobody used. A forgotten corner of the camp, out of view, out of mind, but not out of earshot. His barking started at dusk, wild and guttural, rising like a siren, then collapsing into a hoarse growl. The sound sliced through every meal, every letter, every moment of uneasy peace. Attempts were made. One corporal from Kentucky swore he could tame him, claimed he'd raised bloodhounds back home. He lasted less than 10 minutes. Buck lunged through the cage bars, sank his teeth into the man's sleeve, and nearly took his wrist. The corporal came back with bandages and trembling fingers. No charges were pressed. Just one more chain added to Buck's restraints. After that, the guards avoided the cage unless absolutely necessary. The MPs dropped food and water with long poles, never stepping close. Then, one day, WWII walked by. She hadn't meant to. The path to the water pump had been blocked, and she'd been rerouted past the old perimeter. That's when she saw him, crouched low in the shadow of the cage, eyes like frostbite. He didn't bark, he didn't move, he just watched. WWII stopped. The guard behind her shifted. "Keep moving," he said, but she didn't hear him. Not fully. Something in the stillness pulled at her. Not fear, not pity, but recognition. The way Buck's shoulders tensed, the way his breath came slow through his teeth. It reminded her of a soldier she'd once treated in Mindoro, a boy who'd stared at her like that after a shelling, blank and wild, his legs gone below the knee. Their eyes met, just for a breath, a heartbeat. She bowed her head slightly, as if nodding to a fellow prisoner. Then she walked on. That night, Buck howled less. No, one noticed at first, but the cook mentioned it the next morning, said he slept through the night for the first time in weeks. WWII said nothing, but the next time she passed by the cage, she paused again. And this time Buck stood, but didn't growl. A language neither could speak had been spoken, and something in the fence, something deeper than wire, began to bend. She returned the next morning. No orders, no permission, no reason beyond something neither logic nor language could explain. WWII rose before the sun, folded her blanket, tied her hair, and walked to the far end of the camp where the kitchen smoke hadn't yet drifted and the world still felt empty. She knelt outside the cage. Not close, never close, just far enough that her shadow touched the dirt a few feet from his paws. Buck didn't move. He watched her through the mesh, eyes still pale and hard. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. She stayed for 15 minutes, said nothing, did nothing. Then stood, brushed the dust from her knees, and walked away. That was how it began. The guards didn't notice until the third day. One made a joke about the dog whisperer. Another said they should put her in the cage instead, let nature sort it out. But by the fifth day, Buck still hadn't barked, hadn't snarled, hadn't tried to kill anyone. He just sat there, tail curled neatly beside him, ears perked, staring at the woman who came to see him each morning like clockwork. By the end of the week, she began bringing scraps, crusts of bread, bits of potato. Not to feed him directly. That would have broken the spell. She laid them near the fence, then backed away. Buck wouldn't touch them until she left, but he always did. Every crumb, not one piece wasted. The other prisoners started to whisper. The Italian cooks passed her glances. Even the American guards, hardened by too many months in the sun, found reasons to linger near the fence. They didn't understand it, didn't want to, because what they were seeing made them question something fundamental, about control, about fear, about what it meant when violence wasn't met with violence. By the second week, Buck had stopped pacing. His shoulders no longer trembled with rage. He still didn't wag, but sometimes when WWII sat longer than usual, his ears would tilt forward, and he would lay his head on his paws, not in defeat, but in something close to calm, as if he recognized her shape in the stillness, as if her silence matched a silence buried deep inside him. Some of the guards began keeping logs, notes scrawled on the backs of ration lists. Dog unusually still today. Female POW near kennel again. No aggression recorded since Tuesday. A lieutenant sent a message up the chain, asking if maybe the animal could be transferred, maybe repurposed, maybe useful again. No reply ever came. And still, WWII came. It became a ritual, not just for her, but for the entire camp. Her kneeling became a kind of liturgy, a ceremony held at the edge of civilization, where no one clapped and nothing was said. She never touched the fence. Buck never touched her. But they met again and again, like two ghosts haunting the same ruined house. What no one knew, what no report would record, was the truth of their shared wound. Neither had chosen their war. Neither had walked into violence with hunger in their hearts. They had been trained, broken, reshaped, taught to obey, to kill, to survive without mercy. And now, discarded, untrusted, watched, feared. But in those minutes, in the space between wire and dirt, something ancient and wordless passed between them. The kind of understanding born not of language, but of pain, of knowing what it means to be feared simply for surviving. And day by day that fear began to loosen its grip, just slightly, just enough. The air was dry that morning, dust rising in soft clouds around her steps as she made her way to the cage. She moved slowly, deliberately, the way one approaches a shrine or a grave. WWII had come every day now for almost 3 weeks. She expected nothing. She asked for nothing. She gave only her presence, and in return received silence. Not peace, not yet, but silence. And in that silence, something began to shift. But this day would be different. She reached the cage, bowed her head slightly, and knelt as always, folding her hands in her lap. Buck was already awake, standing in the far corner. His ears were rigid, his breath tight. There was a sound in the distance, boots crunching gravel, metal clinking. A delivery truck, maybe, or a drill. Something had unsettled him. His body was taut like a loaded spring. Yui knew the signs of trauma. She'd seen it in men with burns over half their bodies, in soldiers who spoke to ghosts, in boys who screamed in languages no one recognized. She had seen it that night, the worst night, the one she never spoke of, when a medical tent was overrun in the dark, when orders were shouted not to help the wounded, but to abandon them, when her commander told her to seal the entrance with crates, locking screaming men inside to burn. She had obeyed. She had stepped back from the flames. Her legs had trembled so hard she could barely walk. She had vomited behind a tree before retching again, dry and empty. That night, something in her died. Or worse, something in her lived that should not have. And now, here, a dog stared at her with eyes that had seen too much. She didn't see rage in Buck. She saw fear, not cowardice, but memory, the kind that carves itself into your skin. His teeth were bared, but it was not hunger. His muscles coiled, but it was not dominance. He was bracing for pain. Then, without warning, he lunged. The chain jerked, metal screamed against the bars. The soldiers nearby shouted, reaching for rifles, hands flying to holsters. Dust kicked up in clouds. A guard started forward, but Yui didn't move. She stayed on her knees, her face still lowered. No scream, no flinch. Her hands, trembling slightly now, stayed folded in her lap. She heard the growl, felt the heat of his breath as he struck the end of his chain, felt the quiet before the snap of teeth that never came. And then, silence. When she opened her eyes, he was just feet from her, chest heaving, eyes locked on hers. And slowly, as if pulled downward by some invisible thread, Buck sat. Not collapsed, not defeated. Sat, deliberately, with control. Around them, the men froze. One took off his cap. Another muttered something that sounded like a prayer. The sergeant, who had once called the dog a devil, simply backed away, whispering, "I'll be damned." But Yui didn't see them. She saw only the Hound, and he, somehow, saw her. It was not dominance that had calmed him, not command. It was vulnerability, the kind that disarms more deeply than force. Her kneeling was not an act of control, but of surrender, a choice to be seen without armor. And Buck, in all his scars and fury, had recognized something no uniform could disguise, a wound that matched his own. So he sat, and for the first time in months the camp fell truly quiet. The silence didn't end with that morning. It spread, slow and strange, like a new kind of weather. By the next day, the guards no longer stopped her from approaching the cage. They didn't bark questions or escort her away. They just stood farther back, rifles slung low, watching with something between curiosity and reverence. One sergeant, the one who once joked about putting her in the kennel, simply nodded and unlocked the gate. Yui stepped inside. Buck didn't flinch. He stayed seated, tail resting lightly on the ground, watching her with those cold, storm-colored eyes. She moved slowly, her hand extended but not reaching. When she set the food down, not outside the bars this time, but directly in front of him, he sniffed it once, then ate. Not like an animal starving, but like a guest at a table. By the third day, she brushed him. The camp had an old bristle brush they used for mules. A guard handed it to her without a word. She held it like something sacred. When she pressed it to Buck's fur, he shivered, not from pain, but from the unfamiliarity of gentleness. She brushed with the same rhythm she once used on wounded soldiers, slow, deliberate even. At first he tensed with each stroke, then slowly his shoulders slackened. His eyes closed, and she knew. Some part of him remembered softness. The transformation rippled outward, Other prisoners started gathering at the edge of the fence during her visits, not to jeer, but to watch. The Italians brought scraps of meat, wrapped in napkins. A German medic left a carved wooden bone near the cage, awkward but sincere. The guards grew less formal. One young corporal began offering Yui cigarettes, even though she never smoked. Another asked what her name meant in English. When she answered, "Yui means only," he blinked and said, "That fits." Even meals changed. A few American guards started sitting among the prisoners in the mess hall. It began with shared trays, then stories, then laughter. Still, Yui couldn't rest. She woke each morning with her stomach tight, her thoughts tangled. What was happening? This was the enemy. These were the people who had dropped fire on her city, who had taken her across an ocean in chains. And yet, they were feeding her, talking to her, giving her a brush to soothe a dog that even they had feared. How could kindness feel so much like betrayal? One night she stood outside the kennel long after Buck had curled up to sleep. The moon was high, silver and cold, casting long shadows across the red dirt. She stared at the horizon and whispered the names of people she hadn't spoken of in months. Her brother, her mother, her childhood friend Keiko, who once gave her a silk ribbon before vanishing in the firebombing. If they saw me now, she thought, would they hate me? But then she turned, and there was Buck, eyes open, watching her from the dark. He didn't rise, he didn't bark, he just watched, calm, steady, present, and for the first time she wondered if healing was not weakness, but rebellion. If choosing gentleness in this place of barbed wire and uniforms was the most dangerous act of all. She knelt beside the cage, not as a prisoner, not as a nurse, but simply as a human being. And Buck, once a weapon of war, rested his head against the bars, not in obedience, in trust. And Yui, for the first time, let herself believe she could be more than what the war had made of her. The envelope lay like a stone in her hand, blank, waiting. It had been issued with little fanfare, slid under her tray one morning by a guard with kind eyes and too many freckles. "You can write home," he'd said, then added more gently, "if there's someone left to write to." Yui hadn't touched it for 2 days. She kept it beneath her blanket, untouched, unopened, as if words might leak through the paper and betray her. Who was she writing to? Her mother, if she still lived. Perhaps a cousin, a ghost. Her home had become a memory, and even that was starting to blur. The sound of slippers on tatami, the smell of miso in the morning, her brother's laughter echoing down a narrow alley. Nagasaki had gone silent after the bomb. No letters came, no news, just absence. Now she was expected to speak into that silence. What could she say? That the Americans had fed her? That their dogs now followed her like lambs? That the camp was not a pit, but a place where men played harmonicas under stars and women laughed in languages she was starting to understand? She held the pencil over the page and stared. Finally, she began with the simplest thing. "I am alive." She paused, then added, "I am in Texas. It is very hot. The earth is red and the sky is enormous." Her hand trembled. She wrote about the food, the bread that no longer startled her, the fruit she had tasted for the first time, orange, tart, sweet. She described the barracks, the way the sheets were changed weekly, how the guards no longer stared at her with suspicion, but nodded as she passed. She wrote of the other prisoners, the Germans who traded buttons, the Italians who told bad jokes. Then she stopped. She sat for a long time with her hand pressed to the page. Finally, in slow strokes, she wrote, "There is a dog here. His name is Buck. He was trained to hurt people, but he does not bite me. She underlined the last sentence, then continued, "Neither do the guards. I eat 3 meals a day. They gave me soap. They let me touch the dog. He listens to me." Something cracked open. She wrote more, about the silence they shared, about how the dog leaned against her knee now, how he once growled at a lieutenant who raised his voice in her direction. She wrote, "I do not know what to feel. They are kind to me, and I do not know if I am allowed to accept it." When she finished, she folded the paper carefully and slid it into the envelope. Her hands shook as she sealed it, as if the act of naming this place, this strange, gentle enemy camp, might turn it into something she could never take back. She delivered the letter to the guard with the freckles. He took it without speaking, his eyes scanning her face as if trying to read what the envelope could not say. The next day, she found 2 more sheets of paper tucked beneath her pillow. No words, just the gift. If you're moved by this story so far, let us know where you're watching from and leave a comment below. Don't forget to like the video. It helps us bring more forgotten stories like this to light. The news came not with a bang, but a murmur, a passing phrase in a soldier's conversation. A German prisoner with fluent English heard it first. "It's over. The Emperor's voice. They surrendered." Words spread like smoke, curling into every barrack, every kitchen, every cell. By sundown it was no longer rumor. The war had ended. Japan had fallen. There was no celebration in the women's compound, no cries of joy, just silence, the kind that pressed against your ears and made you feel underwater. Yui sat on the edge of her bunk, staring at her hands. They didn't look like her hands anymore. The skin had healed, the calluses softened, but inside the war still lived. A guard came by later, nervous, formal. "You'll be sent home, soon." He offered it like a gift, but his eyes flickered away from hers. She nodded, thanked him in English. The word felt strange in her mouth. That night she visited Buck. He was lying near the gate, nose resting on his paws, eyes heavy but alert. The desert wind rattled the chain-link fence behind him, and the moon hung low and yellow like an old coin. Yui stepped inside the cage without hesitation now. He didn't rise. He just looked at her, and she knew he already understood. She knelt beside him, brushing her fingers over the thick fur at his neck. The bristles were rougher now, dusted with gray. He had aged in captivity, as she had. But still, he watched her with the same steady gaze, a gaze that had once terrified the guards and now made them pause in quiet respect. "I am leaving," she said softly in Japanese, "but not forgetting." Buck, or rather Haru, lifted his head. It had been her secret name for him, chosen weeks earlier. She had never spoken it aloud to anyone else. Haru, meaning spring, not because he was soft or bright or warm, but because he was a beginning, a thaw, a strange kind of bloom breaking through scorched ground. She pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "You brought me back." He licked her hand once, then laid his head down again. The next morning the prisoners were lined up and given parcels, a blanket, a train ticket, a sack of bread and fruit, a folder with their name written in English. When Yui opened hers, she found her own letter inside, returned unopened, unread. It hit her harder than she expected, but tucked behind the pages was something else, a small black-and-white photo. Buck, standing tall beside the cage, ears perked, gaze locked on the camera. It must have been taken without her knowing. She didn't cry. Not until the train began to move. From her seat near the window, she watched the edge of the camp blur into the desert. The dust rose in long ribbons. The barracks shrank. The wire vanished. But in her lap, She clutched the photo like a talisman, her thumb brushing gently over his face. He would never be a pet, never be tame, but he had known her, and she had known him, and in a war defined by orders, by fire and silence, by names stripped and identities erased, she had given him one. Haru. Spring. The report was thin, only a few pages. Faded type, a few scribbled notes in English. It had been filed away in a quiet corner of the Army's post-war records office, marked non-critical human interest. Most never read it, but one man did. A former guard with pale hair and sunburned ears who'd been at the Texas camp the year the dog sat down. He remembered her. Yui Mori, POW number 4421. Silent, composed, never raised her voice. The one with the dog. Now, years later, in the ruins of post-war Nagasaki, she was not a nurse in uniform or a prisoner behind wire. She was a midwife, not just catching babies in cramped wooden homes, but teaching young girls, war orphans, widows, students, how to care for life instead of fear it. Her classes were small, sometimes the roof leaked, but she taught anyway, not just technique, but tenderness. One line in the report stuck out, a translation of something she had told a visiting American journalist. The weak need hands that do not shake. Even the enemy, if they bleed, needs a clean cloth. Another line, written not in the report, but on the edge of her old letter, preserved in the camp's archives, had been underlined in pencil. The beast only needed gentleness. So did I. No one quite knew what happened to the dog. Some said Buck, Haru, was transferred to a nearby farm. Others claimed a sympathetic guard took him home, though no record confirmed it. But the strange thing was this. After Yui left, he never bit again. Not a single snap, not a single growl. One corporal, now retired, swore that the dog used to sit by the edge of the yard each morning, staring at the gate like he was waiting for her to return. He never did see her again. But the story spread, quietly, like wind through reeds, among guards, then their families, and eventually through letters and newspapers. A Japanese woman who tamed a war dog with silence, a prisoner who brought peace to a creature bred for chaos. It was too strange to be myth, too gentle to be strategy. It became legacy. Years later, a woman in Kyoto named her daughter Yui after reading the story in a translated magazine. In a small American town in New Mexico, a retired guard had a carved wooden statue of a dog and a girl facing each other in perfect stillness on his mantel. He never explained it. He didn't need to. In Nagasaki, Yui Mori never gave lectures, never wrote a book. She lived simply, tending to mothers, to frightened girls, to boys who flinched at thunder. She planted rosemary outside her door. She kept the photo of Haru tucked inside a worn cloth pouch, placed between a Bible given to her by a German nun and a tin of herbs she used for pain. She never tamed the war. Not really, but she found one place, one moment, where gentleness held the line, where a dog sat, where silence was stronger than chains, and in a world rebuilt by hands once trained for violence, her touch reminded many that some things do not need to be defeated, only understood. If this story stayed with you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And hit like. It truly helps us keep these lost histories alive.